Hello and welcome to CET 4884. In the previous session, we addressed the fundamental aspects of documenting risk via the process of risk identification, assessment, and classification. In this session, we will address risk control strategies and learn how to select the proper control based on our assessment to the identified risk. We will also discuss the cost-benefit analysis of implementing these controls. Uh, In the last session, we talked about the identification or the process of identifying the organization's assets, the threats, and the vulnerabilities. Once the project team for information security development has created the ranked vulnerabilities, so once we have that documented in a worksheet, the team must choose one of four basic strategies. Um, the basic strategies to control the risks that result from these vulnerabilities, supported and empowered by, of course, the upper management. The four risk strategies guide an organization to first apply safeguards that eliminate or reduce the remaining uncontrolled risk for the vulnerability, and that will be avoidance, transfer the risk to other um, areas or to outside, and that will be transference, transferring the risk to other people, reduce the impact uh, um, should the vulnerability be exploited, so that's the mitigation, um, and if we can eliminate or terminate the risk, that would be great. The last thing is inform themselves of all the consequences and accept the risk without control or mitigation, and that will be or this strategy will be called acceptance. So those are the strategies that we have. We need to defend, we need to transfer, mitigate, accept, and terminate. And again, sometimes you cannot terminate or eliminate the risk totally, but you can reduce it as much as possible. Uh, the defense or avoidance strategy is the preferred approach, as it seeks to avoid risk in its total, rather than deal with it after it has been realized. This risk control strategy attempts to prevent the realization or exploitation of the vulnerability. Avoidance is accomplished through countering threats, removing vulnerabilities in assets, limiting access to assets, and or adding protective safeguards to those assets. The most common methods of avoidance involve three areas of controls: avoidance through application of policy, training and education for the employees, and through the different technologies that can be implemented or used in the organization. Transfer is a control strategy that attempts to shift the risk to other assets, other processes, or other organizations. Could be like a contractor from outside the company. If an organization does not already have quality security management and administration experience, it should hire individuals or firms who can provide such expertise of security management or risk management. This allows the organization to transfer the risk associated with the management of these complex systems to another organization with established experience in dealing with those risks. Um, Mitigation is the control strategy that attempts to reduce the impact caused by the exploitation of vulnerability through planning and preparation. You will be prepared, you will know exactly what to do, you have the plan, and you start implementing the plan. So this strategy is being implemented after an attack. Based on that, it includes three types of planning: planning for disaster recovery, planning for business continuity, and planning for incidents response. Mitigation begins with the early detection that an attack is in progress. The most common of the mitigation procedure is the disaster recovery plan. The disaster recovery plan includes the entire spectrum of activities to recover from an incident. The disaster recovery plan can include strategies to limit losses before and during the disaster. Those plans usually include all preparations for the recovery process, strategies to limit losses during the disaster, and detailed steps to follow when the disaster has ended. The actions an organization can and perhaps should take while the incident is in progress should be defined in a document referred to as the Incident Response Plan, or the IRP. The IRP provides answers to questions victims might pose in the midst of disaster. It answers the questions of what do I do now? What should the administrators do first? What should they contact? Or who should they contact? And what should they document? The DRP and the IRP planning overlap to a degree. In many regards, the DRP is the uh, subsection of the IRP that covers disasters or disastrous events. While some DRP and IRP decisions and actions are the same, their urgency and results can differ dramatically. The DRP focuses more on preparations completed before and actions taken after the incident, while the IRP focuses on intelligence gathering, information analysis, coordinated decision making, and urgent uh, concrete actions. The third type of planning document under mitigation is the business continuity plan. How can we put the business back into place? How can we continue with the business? The business continuity plan is the most strategic and long-term plan of the three plans. It encompasses the continuation of business activities if a catastrophic event occurs, such as the loss of an entire database, building, or operations center. The business continuity plan includes planning for the steps to ensure the continuation of the organization when the scope or scale of a disaster exceeds the DRP's ability to restore operations. The fourth control strategy is acceptance, where an organization evaluates the risk of vulnerability and allows the risky state to continue as is. The only acceptance strategy that is recognized as valid occurs when the organization has determined the level of risk, assessed the probability of attack, estimated the potential damage that could occur from these attacks, performed a thorough cost benefit analysis, evaluated controls using each appropriate type of feasibility, and decided that the particular function, service, information, or asset did not justify the cost of protection. Acceptance of risk is the choice to do nothing to protect a vulnerability and to accept the outcome of its exploitation. This control, or rather lack of control, is based on the assumption that it may be prudent business decision to examine the alternatives and determine that the cost of protecting an asset does not justify the security expenditure. The term risk appetite is used to describe the degree to which an organization is willing to accept risk as a trade-off to the expense of applying controls. The terminate control strategy directs the organization to avoid those business activities that introduce uncontrollable risks. If some of these activities are required to meet customer needs, then alternative activities will be recommended to replace the uncontrollable activities. So termination in this concept is termination of any risk that or any activities that can be or can create risk for the company or the business. And again, if we can terminate those activities, that would be great. But if those activities are required for the company, then that will be an issue, and we have to deal with the risk as it comes. So one of the options is to terminate that activity to avoid those uncontrollable risks associated with it. The level of threat and value of the asset should play a major role in the selection of strategy. The following rules of thumb can be applied in selecting the preferred strategy. When a vulnerability exists, implement assurance techniques to reduce the likelihood of a vulnerability being exercised. When a vulnerability can be exploited, apply layered protections, architectural designs, and administrative controls to minimize the risk or prevent this occurrence. When the attacker's cost is less than his or her potential gain, apply protections to increase the attacker's cost. Example, use system controls to limit what a system user can access and do, thereby significantly reducing an attacker's gain. When potential loss is substantial, apply design principles, architectural designs, and technical and non-technical protections to limit the extent of the attack, thereby reducing the potential for loss. This figure shows the process of risk handling and decision-making points. Before deciding on the strategy for a specific vulnerability, all information about the economic and non-economic consequences of the vulnerability facing the information asset must be explored and studied. The feasibility study will ask questions about the possible implementation of the controls, including the advantages and the cost, comparing that to the cost and results of not implementing these controls, or the disadvantages of these controls. The cost-benefit analysis is an economic feasibility of implementation approach commonly considered for a project of information security controls and safeguards. An organization begins by evaluating the worth of the information assets to be protected and the loss in value if those information assets are compromised by the specific vulnerability. It is only common sense that an organization should not spend more to protect an asset that is not worth it. Some of the factors that impact the cost of a control or safeguards include cost of development or acquisition, the cost of training or training fees, cost of implementation, service cost, and cost of maintenance. Once an organization has estimated the worth of various assets, it can begin to examine the potential loss that could occur from the exploitation of vulnerability or a threat occurrence. This process results in the estimate of potential loss per risk. The questions that must be asked here include what damage could occur and what financial impact would the risk have or the vulnerability have. what would it cost to recover from the attack, in addition to the costs from the previous questions? What is the single loss expectancy of each risk? In its simplest definition, the cost benefit analysis is whether or not the control alternative being evaluated is worth the associated costs incurred to control the specific vulnerability. While many cost benefit analysis techniques exist for our purposes, the cost benefit analysis is most easily calculated using the ALE from earlier assessment, um, which is the analyzed loss expectancy. The cost benefit analysis will equal to the analyzed loss expectancy minus prior to post minus the analyzed cost of the safeguard. Once the controls in place, they must be monitored and re-evaluated to determine the effectiveness of the implementation. In addition, the estimated residual risk must be calculated. Actually, we need to calculate it accurately to adjust existing controls or to apply new controls. So we have to look at that residual risk and see how much risks still exist. The process of re-evaluation continues in a loop as long as the organization in business to make sure that no other risks have been popping up and coming to the system, and to make sure that those residual risks are not going into the red zone and being more of extreme risk to the system. This figure shows the risk control cycle and the re-evaluation process to adjust controls or apply new controls. The quantitative risk analysis performs risk probability and impact assessment. The probability investigates the likelihood that each risk will occur, while impact investigates the potential effect on the organization information system using actual values or estimates. Then probability and impact matrix is used to prioritize risk for future quantitative analysis and response based on their ranking. That will be followed with risk categorization, where the risk can be categorized based on the source of that risk. In the qualitative risk analysis, the steps will be completed using non-numerical measures that might not provide the accurate assessment needed. Now, remember that it's just qualitative, so it's like anecdotal information that we are using to classify or categorize risk. While if you have numerical and probability calculation, it might be more accurate. Benchmarking is an alternative strategy to the cost benefit analysis, which approaches risk management from a different angle, or looks at risk management from a different angle. Instead of determining the financial value of information and then implementing security as an acceptable percentage of that value, an organization could look at peer institutions to determine what other people, what other companies, what other organizations are doing to protect their information. And this is what we call benchmarking. It's the process of seeking out and studying the practices using in other or used in other organizations that produce the results you desire in your organization. When benchmarking, an organization typically uses one of the two measures to compare practices to determine which practices it would prefer to implement. The first set of measures are metrics based on the second set metrics based. I'm sorry, metrics based, and the second set are process based measures. So the metrics based measures are comparisons based on numerical standards such as what are the number of successful attacks, staff hours spent on system protection, dollars spent on protection, number of security personnel, estimated losses in dollars of information due to successful attacks, loss in productivity hours associated with successful attacks. And you look at these measures and you can see that they are numeric or metric based measures. An organization uses this information by ranking competitive businesses um, within a similar size or market and determining how their measures compare to others. The process-based measure are generally less number focused and more strategic than metrics-based measures. For each of these areas or the areas of the organization is interested in benchmarking, process-based measures enable the companies to examine the activities and individual company performs in pursuit of its goals rather than the specific of how goals were attained. The primary focus is the method the organization uses to accomplish a particular process rather than the outcome. In information security, two categories of benchmarks are used: standards of due care, due diligence, and best practices. Within best practices is a subcategory of practices referred to as the gold standard. Those practices typically viewed as the best of the best. When organizations adopt levels of security for legal defense, they may need to show that they have done what any practical organization would do in similar circumstances. This is referred to as the standard of due care. It's insufficient to just implement these standards and then ignore them. The application of controls at or above the prescribed levels and the maintenance of these standards of due care show that the organization has performed due diligence. So due diligence is the demonstration that the organization is diligent in ensuring that the implemented standards continue to provide the required level of protection. Failure to support a standard of due diligence can open an organization to legal liability, provided it can be shown that the organization was negligent in its application or lack of application of information protection. Security efforts that seeks to provide a superior level of performance in the protection of information are referred to as the best business practices or simply best practices or recommended practices. Best security practices are those security efforts that are among the best in the industry, balancing the need to access with the need to provide adequate protection. Best practices seek to provide as much security as possible for information and systems while maintaining a solid degree of responsibility. When considering best practices for adoption in your organization, consider the following. Does your organization resemble the identified target organization of the best practices? Are the resources you can expend similar to those identified in the best practices? A best practice proposal that assumes unlimited funding and does not identify needed trade-offs will be of limited value of your approach and has strict resource limits. And then, are you in a similar threat environment as the proposed in the best practice? A proposal of best practice from months and even weeks ago may not be appropriate for the current threat environment. The biggest problem with benchmarking in information security is that or organizations in general don't talk to each other. Another problem with benchmarking is that no two organizations are identical. The circumstances, situations, the culture within the company is totally different. The third problem is that the best practices are a moving target. Uh, it's best practice now, as we said, like in the previous slide, but maybe in 9 months, 10 months, 12 months, they are not anymore. So we need to move forward. So what worked well 2 years ago may be completely worthless against today's threats. By the time you analyze best practices and implement the threats, uh, implement them, the threats will be different. One last issue to consider is that simply knowing what was going on a few years ago, as in benchmarking, does not necessarily tell us what to do next. Again, everything is changing. Technology, advancement in technology, the ability of hackers, the threats, the different threats available, all that changes. So we need to stay current with all these situations. Baselining is the analysis of measures against established standards. In information security, baselining is having a baseline of security activities and events that can be compared to the organization's future performance. When baselining, it's useful to have guide to the overall process. In addition to the cost benefit analysis and the best practices, there are other feasibility studies that can be used to assess security alternatives for the organization. Organizational feasibility study examines how well the proposed information security alternatives will contribute to the efficiency, effectiveness, and overall operation of an organization. Above and beyond the impact on the bottom line, the organization must determine how the proposed alternatives contribute to the business objectives of the organization. And again, the purpose is now to increase the efficiency and protect the information so you can function well. So we are looking for the organization's operations. So that's why we are trying to protect the information or the assets of the company. The operation feasibility or operational feasibility study, which examines user and management acceptance and support, and the overall requirements of organizations' stakeholders. The technical feasibility study examines if the organization has or can acquire the technology necessary to implement and support the control alternatives. And last, the political feasibility study, which defines what can or cannot occur based on consequences or consensus and relationships. It's very important to document security alternatives analysis, security measures and controls implementations, and mostly to document the results of the implementation. This is how we learn in other projects, other processes, and other areas. So documenting the outcome of control strategy will assist in the continuous analysis and in adjusting or changing these controls to a better or more efficient controls, and how to also implement those type of controls in other areas. The asset threat pair with the implemented control can be documented as an action plan that has specific tasks with assigned accountability to a unit or individual. So that will be all for this session. If you have any questions about risk management, please let me know. Have a great day.